Are you sure you want me to do that? I asked, and my son didn't even look up from his phone when he told me to sell the house like it was already a done deal, like it wasn't the place I'd spent 32 years paying off, raising him in, fixing every leaky pipe and cracked window with my own hands, like it was just another asset on a spreadsheet he could move around whenever it suited him. And the way he said it so casually, so confidently, that was the moment I realized he wasn't asking, not really, he was telling me, and worse, he believed he had the right to. Mom, it's just smart, Daniel said, finally glancing at me with that tight, practiced smile he used in meetings, not with family. The market's high, the place is too big for you, and honestly, you're just sitting on value that could be working for you. I nodded slowly, letting the silence stretch just a second too long because I wanted to hear how far he'd take it, and he didn't disappoint. He leaned back like he'd already won, like the conversation was just a formality. I've already talked to a realtor, he added, tapping his screen like he was closing a deal, not dismantling my life, and I remember noticing something small, something most people would miss. He didn't say we should think about it, he said, I've already. Like the decision had been made somewhere I wasn't invited, and that told me everything. I folded my hands in my lap and kept my voice even. You've already talked to a realtor, I repeated, not as a question, just letting the words sit there, and he sighed like I was being difficult, like I was the problem. Mom, don't make this harder than it needs to be, he said, and there it was, that shift, subtle but sharp, from suggestion to pressure, from son to something else entirely, and I could feel it building under the surface, the impatience, the assumption that I'd fall in line like I always had, that I'd trust him because he was my son, because he said it was for my own good, and maybe 10 years ago I would have, maybe even 5, but not anymore. Not after everything I'd learned about how quickly what's best for you turns into what works for me. I tilted my head slightly and watched him, really watched him this time, the expensive watch, the polished shoes, the confidence that bordered on arrogance, and I wondered when exactly he stopped seeing this house as a home and started seeing it as leverage. It's just a house, he added, softer now, like he thought that would make it easier, like minimizing it would make me let go, and I almost smiled, because that was the moment he gave himself away completely, because to him it was just a house, but to me it was the one thing he thought he could take, and he had no idea how wrong he was. I took a slow breath and looked him straight in the eye, calm, steady, no anger, no hesitation, just clarity. Are you sure you want me to do that? I asked again, and this time he smiled, confident, certain, already picturing the outcome in his favor. Yes, he said, without a second of doubt, and that was all I needed to hear. Daniel did not wait for my answer the next morning. He moved like everything was already in motion, like I had signed something I had never even seen, and by 10 o'clock he was back at the house with a folder in his hand and that same calm, polished energy that used to impress people who did not know him the way I did. I spoke with the realtor again, he said as he stepped into the kitchen without knocking, like it was still his place to walk into whenever he wanted. She can list it by the end of the week if we move quickly. I poured my coffee slowly, taking my time, letting him fill the silence because I knew he would, he always did. We are looking at offers within 30 days, maybe sooner, he added, setting the folder down on the counter and sliding it toward me like it was something I should be grateful for, like he was doing me a favor. I glanced at it but did not open it. Not yet. That is fast, I said, keeping my voice even. And he nodded like that proved his point. Exactly, that is why we should not hesitate, he said, and there it was again, that word should, not could, not might, should, like there was only one reasonable path and he had already decided what it was. I took a small sip of coffee and leaned against the counter, watching him carefully, because now he was not just suggesting anymore. He was building a case, laying it out piece by piece like a presentation. The maintenance alone is costing you thousands every year, he continued, flipping open the folder himself when I did not touch it, pointing to numbers and charts I had no interest in. Property taxes, repairs, utilities, it does not make sense. For one person. I nodded slightly, not agreeing, just acknowledging, because I wanted him to keep going, and he did. You could downsize, move somewhere easier, somewhere modern, he said, softening his tone like he was trying to sell me comfort now instead of pressure, and invest the rest, make your money work for you. I almost laughed at that because it sounded rehearsed, like he had practiced it in front of a mirror, and maybe he had, maybe this conversation had been planned long before he ever brought it to me. You have thought this through, I said quietly, and he smiled, just a little proud of himself. Of course I have, he replied, and that was when I saw it clearly. This was never a conversation to him, it was a conclusion, and I was just expected to catch up. He straightened up and crossed his arms, watching me now, waiting for me to fall in line, and when I did not move, did not reach for the papers, did not say yes, something in his expression shifted, not anger, Not yet, but impatience. Mom, this is what is best, he said again, slower this time, like repeating it would make it true, and I set my cup down gently, the sound soft but deliberate. Best for who? I asked, and for the first time he hesitated just for a second, but I caught it, and then he recovered quick, smooth. For you, obviously, he said, but it did not land the same, not anymore, because now I was listening differently, now I was paying attention to what he was not saying, and that was when he made his next move, the one he thought would close the deal. He tapped the folder again, firmer this time, and said, "You know I have a say in this too." And just like that, the air in the room changed, quieter, heavier, because now he was not talking about advice or suggestions, now he was talking about control, and he looked at me like he expected that to settle it, like that was the part where I would finally give in. But I did not. I just held his gaze, calm, steady, and let the silence stretch, because the more he talked, the more he showed me exactly what he thought he had, and exactly how sure he was that I had nothing left to counter it. He held my gaze like he had just said something final, something that could not be challenged, and for a moment the room felt smaller, like the walls themselves were waiting to see what I would do next. But I did not rush, I did not react the way he expected. I simply nodded once, slow and measured, and that seemed to irritate him more than if I had argued. "You have a say," I repeated, letting the words settle between us, and he straightened slightly, encouraged, thinking I was finally starting to understand. "Exactly," he said, his tone sharpening just a little. "This is not just your decision." And there it was again, that shift, clearer now, no longer hidden behind concern or logic. This was about position, about authority, about who got to decide what happened next. I turned slightly and walked to the sink, rinsing my cup even though it was already clean, just to give him space to keep talking, because the more he spoke, the more he revealed, and right on cue he followed. "I mean, you remember how we structured things," he said, lowering his voice like he was reminding me of something important, something binding. "I am not just your son in this, I am a stakeholder," he added, and that word hung in the air heavier than anything else he had said so far. Stakeholder, not family, not partner, stakeholder, like this house had been reduced to numbers and percentages, like I had been reduced to a line item in his plan. I dried my hands slowly and turned back to face him, keeping my expression calm, almost neutral, because I could see the confidence building in him now. He thought he had reached the point where I would fold. "How much of a say do you think you have?" I asked quietly, and he did not hesitate this time, not even for a second. "Enough," he said, firm, direct, and then he stepped closer, lowering his voice just enough to feel controlled but not aggressive. "Enough to make sure this does not drag out," he continued, and I noticed the choice of words, not if but when, not discussion but outcome. He was not here to figure things out, he was here to enforce them, and for the first time there was a hint of pressure underneath it all. Subtle but unmistakable. "I would rather we handle this the easy way," he added, and that was as close as he would come to calling it a warning. I tilted my head slightly, studying him, because now I could see the full picture, the preparation, the assumptions, the belief that he had already secured his position long before this conversation ever happened. And maybe he thought that because I had stayed quiet, because I had not pushed back, because I had let him talk and talk and talk, that I was falling behind, that I was trying to catch up to something he had already decided. But the truth was much simpler than that. I was letting him show me everything, every angle, every piece he thought he had on the board. And when he finally stopped speaking, when the room went quiet again, I gave him exactly what he had been waiting for, just not in the way he expected. I nodded once more, calm, steady, and said, "All right." And the relief on his face was immediate, quick, and unguarded. Like he had just crossed the finish line, like everything from this point on was just paperwork. "Good," he said, exhaling slightly as his shoulders relaxed. "I knew you would see it my way." And I almost smiled, not because he was right, but because he was so completely certain that he was. And as he reached for the folder again, already moving to the next step, already thinking ahead to closing dates and numbers and outcomes, I glanced past him toward the hallway where the old phone sat on the small wooden table, quiet, untouched, waiting, and for just a brief moment, I considered how different this conversation would feel in a few days. Then I looked back at him and said nothing at all, because sometimes the most powerful move is letting someone believe they have already won. He left that afternoon like everything was settled, like the next time he walked through that door it would be to finalize details, not revisit decisions, and I watched him go without stopping him, without correcting him, because there was nothing left to say, not yet. The quiet that followed felt different, not heavy, not uncertain, just still, like the house itself understood something he did not. I waited until his car disappeared down the street before I moved, slow, deliberate, not rushed. Because this was never about reacting, it was about timing. I walked down the hallway, past the framed photos he used to stop and look at when he was younger, back when this place still meant something more than numbers to him, and I reached the small wooden table where the phone sat, exactly where it had always been, untouched, reliable. I picked it up and dialed a number I knew by memory, not because I used it often, but because some things you do not forget. It rang once, twice, and then his voice came through, steady, familiar. "Richard Hayes," he said, and I could almost hear the faint shuffle of papers in the background, the quiet order of someone who built his life on structure and precision. "It is Margaret Collins," I said, and there was a brief pause, not confusion, just recognition settling in. "Margaret," he replied, calm as ever. "It has been a while." I looked out toward the living room, toward the space Daniel had just stood in hours earlier, so certain, so sure of himself. "It has," I said, my voice even. "But I believe it is time we review everything." Another pause, slightly longer this time, because Richard was not the kind of man who rushed into words. He understood what sat underneath them. "Has something changed?" he asked, and I allowed myself the smallest hint of a smile, because that was the right question, not what happened, not why now, just whether the situation had shifted. "No," I said quietly. "Something has finally revealed itself, and—" That was enough. I could hear it in the way he exhaled, the subtle adjustment in his tone. He understood, not the details yet, but the direction. "I see," he said, and then more directly. "Are we proceeding?" I turned slightly, resting my hand against the wall, feeling the familiar texture under my fingertips, grounding, steady. "Yes," I answered, no hesitation, no doubt. "We are." There was no surprise on his end, no questions about whether I was certain, because that conversation had happened years ago, long before Daniel ever thought to position himself the way he had, long before any of this became visible. "Then I will prepare the documents," Richard said, already moving forward, already aligning pieces that had been set in place long ago. "I will need you to come in," he added, and I nodded even though he could not see me. "I will be there tomorrow morning," I said, and as I hung up the phone, I felt something settle into place, not anger, not even satisfaction, just clarity, the kind that comes when everything lines up exactly the way it was meant to. I walked back into the kitchen and looked at the folder Daniel had left behind, still sitting there, open, full of plans and projections and timelines that assumed I was a step behind, that assumed I was catching up. I closed it gently and set it aside because none of it mattered, not the numbers, not the charts, not the urgency he tried to create. What mattered was that he believed he understood the board, that he believed he had already calculated every move. And as I turned off the kitchen light and headed down the hall, I realized something almost too simple. He had prepared for a conversation, I had prepared for a decision, and those two things were never the same. I arrived at Richard Hayes's office 10 minutes early the next morning, not because I was anxious, but because I have always believed that timing says more than words ever can. And when you are about to make a move that changes everything, you do not rush it, you arrive prepared. His office sat on the 12th floor of a quiet building downtown, the kind of place that did not need to impress anyone because the people who walked in already understood its value. I took the elevator up, steady, calm, and when the doors opened, his assistant greeted me like no time had passed at all. "Good morning, Mrs. Collins," she said with a polite smile, and I returned it with a small nod. "He is expecting you," she added, and of course he was. Richard was always expecting what mattered. He stood when I walked into his office, extending his hand, firm but not overly familiar. "Margaret," he said again, and I could see it in his eyes. He was already reading the situation, already placing pieces together without needing them explained. I sat across from him, setting my purse down beside the chair, no hesitation, no second thoughts, because those had already been dealt with long before. "This moment, you said it was time," he began, folding his hands on the desk, calm, composed. "So let us not waste it." I appreciated that about him, no unnecessary conversation, no attempts to soften what needed to be direct. "Daniel wants to sell the house," I said, and he gave a small nod, not surprised, just acknowledging the surface level of the situation. "And he believes he has the leverage to make that happen," I continued, and that was when something shifted, not visibly, not dramatically, but enough for me to notice because Richard did not react to emotions, he reacted to structure. "Believes," he repeated carefully, and I held his gaze steady. "Yes," I said, and for a brief second the room went quiet, not awkward, just focused, like everything was aligning into place. He leaned back slightly, considering, then reached for a file on the corner of his desk, one that had been there long before I walked in, one that had not been touched in years but had never been forgotten. "We structured your assets to prevent exactly this kind of pressure," he said, opening it with deliberate precision, flipping through pages that most people would not understand but that I remembered very clearly, because I had asked every question back then, every detail, every possibility. That was the point, I replied, and he gave a small nod of agreement. Then nothing has changed, he said simply, and there it was, the clarity I already knew but needed to hear out loud, not for reassurance but for confirmation. No, I said. Nothing has changed. He adjusted the paper slightly and turned one page toward me, tapping it lightly with his finger. Your ownership remains protected under the structure we established, he explained, his tone even factual, however, and that word hung for just a moment, not as a warning but as a transition. His shares can be liquidated under the conditions outlined here. I looked down at the document, not because I needed to read it again, but because I wanted to feel the weight of it, the simplicity of it, the inevitability of it, all the years between then and now suddenly narrowing into one clear path. How quickly? I asked, lifting my eyes back to his, and he did not hesitate, not even slightly. If we begin today, everything can be executed within 48 hours. He said, calm as ever. Like he was discussing something routine, something ordinary, and I nodded once because that was all I needed, no hesitation, no doubt, just decision. Then we begin today, I said, and he closed the file with a soft final sound, already moving forward, already setting things into motion that Daniel had not even considered. And as I sat there signing the first document placed in front of me, I realized something almost too simple. Daniel thought he had given me a deadline, but in reality he had just given me the timing I needed. By the time I left Richard's office, everything was already in motion, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the kind of quiet precision that does not leave room for mistakes. Documents were being filed, calls were being made, and somewhere in the background, numbers were shifting in ways Daniel had never considered. I drove home slowly, not because I needed time to think, but because there was nothing left to figure out. The decision had already been made. And now it was simply unfolding. Exactly as it was designed to. When I pulled into the driveway, the house looked the same as it always had, still familiar, unchanged, and I sat in the car for a moment, hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, just taking that in, because for all the talk about selling it, about moving on, about letting go, this place had never actually been at risk, not really. Daniel just thought it was. I stepped inside and everything felt quiet, almost too quiet, like the calm before something shifts. I walked into the kitchen and noticed the folder he had left behind was exactly where I had placed it. Untouched, waiting. I opened it this time, slowly, flipping through the pages he had been so eager for me to sign, numbers, projections, timelines, all built on one assumption: that I would agree, that I would follow, that I would hand over control because he believed he already had it. I closed the folder again and set it aside because none of it applied anymore, not after this morning, not after the first set of documents had already been signed. I moved through the house at my own pace, not rushing, not avoiding anything, just observing the living room, the hallway, the small details that never made it into any calculation. And somewhere between one room and the next, my phone rang. I did not need to check the name, I already knew. I let it ring once, twice, then answered. Hey Mom. Daniel's voice came through, confident, controlled, but there was something under it now, something sharper. I just spoke with the realtor again, he continued, moving straight into business like nothing had changed. She has a potential buyer interested already, but we need to move fast. I leaned lightly against the wall, listening, letting him talk because he still believed this was his timeline, his process, his decision. I can come by later today and we can go over everything, he added, and I could almost picture him already planning the conversation, already expecting agreement. I let a brief pause settle before responding, just enough to make him pay attention. That will not be necessary, I said calmly, and there was a slight shift on the other end of the line. Not confusion yet, but close. What do you mean? He asked, his tone tightening just a fraction, and I kept my voice steady, unchanged. I mean, there is nothing to go over, I replied, and this time the silence stretched longer because now he was trying to understand something that did not fit into the plan he had already built. Mom, he said, slower now, more deliberate. We already talked about this, and I nodded slightly, even though he could not see it. Yes, I said, we did. Another pause, heavier this time, and I could feel it, the first crack in his certainty, small but there. Then I do not understand, he said, and that was the moment everything began to shift, not because I raised my voice, not because I argued, but because for the first time he was no longer completely sure of where he stood, and I let that moment sit just for a second longer before answering. You will, I said quietly, and then I ended the call, not abruptly, not emotionally, just finished, because the truth was simple. He thought he was moving things forward, but in reality he was already 2 steps behind, and he did not even know it yet. He showed up that evening anyway, of course he did, because Daniel was not the kind of person who waited when something did not go according to plan. He knocked once, quick and firm, then let himself in before I even reached the door, like he needed to reestablish control just by stepping inside. "We need to talk," he said immediately, his voice tighter than before, not loud, not angry, but controlled in a way that told me he was holding something back. I closed the door behind him and walked past him into the living room without rushing, without inviting him to sit, because this was no longer his conversation to lead. He followed, of course, stopping just short of the coffee table, watching me carefully now, trying to read something that was no longer there for him to see. "You hung up on me," he said, and I could hear it, not offense but confusion, like that small act alone had already shifted something he could not quite explain. "I finished the conversation," I replied calmly. And that did not help him. If anything, it made things worse, because now there was no clear angle for him to push against, no emotion to counter, just stillness. "That is not how this works," he said, stepping closer, and there it was again, that assumption, that structure he believed he controlled. I looked at him, steady, unbothered. "Then explain how it works," I said, and for a second, just a second, he hesitated, because he expected resistance, not invitation, but he recovered quickly, straightening his posture, slipping back into that rehearsed certainty. "We agreed to move forward," he said, emphasizing the word "we" like it meant something binding. "You cannot just change direction without talking to me." I let the silence stretch just enough to make him feel it, then nodded slightly. "You are right," I said, and I saw the shift immediately, the relief, the return of confidence, like he had just regained his footing. "Good," he said, exhaling, "so let us sit down and go through the numbers again." He gestured toward the folder still sitting on the table, exactly where he had left it, like it was proof that everything was still on track, but I did not move toward it. I did not even look at it. "There is nothing to go through," I said, and this time the words landed differently, heavier, more final. He frowned slightly, the first real crack showing. "What does that mean?" he asked, slower now, more cautious, and I took a step closer, just enough to hold his attention completely. "It means the situation has already been handled," I said, and now the confusion was clear, no longer hidden behind confidence. "Handled how?" he pressed, his voice tightening again, and I could see it, the moment he realized he was no longer ahead of the conversation, that something had moved without him, something he did not authorize, did not anticipate. I held his gaze, calm, steady, letting that realization build in him before I answered. "Because timing matters, you said you had a say." I began, my tone even, almost gentle. "And you are right, you do." I paused, just long enough for him to lean in slightly, waiting, and then I finished, "Just not in the way you think." And that was the moment everything shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but unmistakably, because for the first time since he walked into this house, Daniel Collins did not know what came next. He blinked, uncertain now, like the air around him had shifted, and I could see it in the way his shoulders lowered just a fraction, that brief hesitation where confidence faltered. "Mom, what are you talking about?" he asked, voice tighter, controlled, yet missing the certainty he had worn all day. I stepped closer, still calm, deliberate. "You believed you were pushing me, controlling the situation," I said evenly, letting each word hang, letting him absorb it. "You believed you had leverage, that you could direct the outcome, but what you did not realize is that leverage does not always lie where you think it does." He frowned, blinking rapidly, trying to piece it together. "I do not understand," he said, and I let a small smile form, not triumphantly but patiently. "Of course not," I replied. "You never saw what had already been set in motion. You never understood that I had options, protections, structures in place long before today, that the house, your shares, everything you thought you could dictate, was never fully in your control." He opened his mouth to respond, and I held up my hand, stopping him gently but firmly. "Do not speak yet," I said, "just listen." And he froze, realization dawning slowly, his eyes widening as comprehension began to settle. "I called Richard Hayes this morning," I continued. "Documents were signed, actions were taken, all within 48 hours, before you could even schedule your next step, before you thought you had me cornered." He shifted, just slightly, the tension rising in his posture as he digested the words. "You did what?" he whispered, and I let that hang because the simplicity of it alone carried the weight. "I acted within the framework already established, the structure we put in place, the safeguards you did not account for," I said calmly, watching him process. "Your shares are liquidated. Your leverage dissolved, and the house remains untouched." His face went pale, confusion, disbelief, and a hint of panic. "I cannot believe this," he stammered, his certainty evaporating. Believe it, I said softly. It is done, executed exactly as it was designed, and there is nothing you can do to reverse it. I saw the moment fully, the first crack in the control he thought he held, his mind racing, recalculating, and I stood there steady, unshaken, because that was the point. The balance had shifted silently, almost imperceptibly but entirely, and I watched him realize finally that the conversation, the house, the power he assumed he had, was never his to command, and for the first time Daniel Collins understood that he had misjudged the one person he had thought he could control, the one person who had been quietly, deliberately, entirely ahead of him the whole time. Daniel stood there, frozen, the weight of everything settling on him all at once, and I watched quietly, calm, because this was the moment I had been preparing for, the moment where certainty met reality. So, I said softly, letting the word hang in the air, not as a question but as a pause, an invitation to feel it. You see now. He could only nod, his face pale, eyes wide, struggling to process. I did not think you would, he whispered, and I smiled, not out of malice but because the truth is sometimes the quietest actions speak the loudest. You believed the house was your leverage, your control, I said, stepping closer, hands relaxed at my sides. But leverage is only real when both sides understand it, and you did not. He swallowed, barely nodding, his mouth moving but no words coming. Everything you counted on has shifted. I continued. Your shares are gone, liquidated. And the house remains exactly as it was, untouched. Secure beyond your influence. The realization hit him fully now, the certainty he had carried all day evaporating, replaced by the stark clarity of what had actually happened. He tried to speak again, but I held up a hand, gentle but firm. No explanations are needed, I said. The actions have been executed, decisions made within the framework we established long ago, and now you are seeing what I have known all along. He sank into the couch, leaning back as if the weight of comprehension pressed on him. I remained standing, calm, controlled, letting him feel the full measure of the shift, the complete reversal of power that he never anticipated. I trusted the process, I said quietly. And today it has proven itself. He nodded slowly, each motion deliberate, hesitant, as if testing the reality of the words. I suppose I underestimated, he admitted finally, and I allowed a small, patient smile. It happens, I replied. But it is important to understand where control truly lies. He looked around the room now, at the walls, the furniture, the pictures, the familiar spaces that had always meant something more than assets. And the house, he said, voice small, almost reverent. It remains ours, unchanged. Exactly, I said, letting that sink in fully. What you thought you could force, what you thought you could claim, was never yours to take. He leaned back further, a quiet sigh escaping him as the enormity of the situation settled. And I knew he understood. Not with words, not with argument, but with the unmistakable weight of realization. I will have to rethink, he murmured, and I nodded. That is wise, I said simply, because sometimes the most powerful lessons are learned in silence. And as he sat there, quiet now, absorbing the truth, I realized that the balance had fully shifted, the lesson delivered with precision, not force, not anger, just clarity. And for the first time all day, Daniel Collins knew exactly who had been in control from the start, and that control had never been his.